All right. Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining me once again for live stream journaling. I'm Eric Scott, and if you want, pop into the comments, say hi. If you want to tell us where you're from, awesome. But today I wanted to get into using collage. I know we've talked about collage before in these videos, but I wanted to talk about integrating collage and how a lot of times when we're doing this mixed media approach, whether it's in our artwork or in our journals, sometimes the collage part can sort of feel like it's sitting on top of everything, like it's floating on top. And how do we then kind of push it down into the page or into the work so that the background just isn't like some fancy frame for a picture? And I think that's one of the things that especially artists that are beginning kind of struggle with, is that they feel like the collage pieces just don't quite fit in with the rest of the page because it gets glued in. It's glued in oftentimes on top of everything else. But the way I work is that I do collage at different parts of the page of the work. So when you do it early, it's a lot easier to kind of incorporate it. It's a lot easier to push it down into the page. But especially when you get to a point where you have lots of layers going on and you glue something in, it can really look like it's kind of just floating on top. So that's what I want to talk about today. That's what I want to kind of address today. So if you've been following along and you've been cutting and gluing stuff into your journal and you just feel like, yeah, this stuff is just sort of there, I don't feel like it's really part of the page, I want to show you some things. And actually these are things that I've already been doing. If you've been paying attention to the videos, if you've been watching them, you may have seen some of this before, but I haven't specifically mentioned it. So today I am going to kind of specifically mention it, and I'll take you through a couple easy techniques that you can use, that you can keep in mind when you're doing any kind of mixed media work. So let's go ahead and switch over so you can see my workspace. So as always, I have my journal. This is the same journal that I've been working in, that Stillman and Byrne mixed media. This is their Epsilon series, which it has the thinner mixed media paper. But when you flip through my journal, you might start to know, well, maybe you don't notice some of the collage, because the collage does start to really feel like it's part of the work, especially in some of these pages up front. Okay, so I want to talk about how we can purposefully push some of the collage. Now, you don't always have to do this. This is not something that you always have to do, but this is a pretty good example of the collage being integrated into the work, and that's because I did it early on. And so I have a rectangular piece of text here from an old book, and that kind of blends in. And that's because I've painted and drawn on top of it. And then I have that map that I talked about before, about how I glued in the strips of map. That map almost disappears right here behind that word becoming. And so it creates kind of a texture underneath. So, but that's kind of what I want to talk about today, is how you can be more purposeful with your collage. Even this has a lot more kind of areas that are more pushed in and really feel like they're part of the page. So I've got some collage materials. I'm not really going to be doing any gluing, but I wanted to talk about the shape of the collage. So that's really important, is when you're thinking about what you're gluing in, what's the shape going to be? So I have a couple examples. So oftentimes we'll cut things out like this brain, and we'll just cut it out in a big rectangle. Actually, that's good, because the rectangle echoes the rectangle of my pages. So that's one thing. It helps tie it in. But if I were to glue this to this page, I mean, number one, it's really big. Even if it was smaller, it still covers up a whole lot. And so people might be like, oh, well, I don't want to glue that there, because then that really covers up just too much. And, you know, I probably wouldn't glue this here because I wouldn't want to cover it up. I might do a transfer, like a tape transfer, and glue that and put that in so that stuff shows through. But some people are like, oh, well, I don't mind it covering up, but I don't like the corners. And that white part really stands out. So what a lot of people will do is they'll cut out what I call a halo. And a halo means that they cut around the object, but they don't cut up right to the edge of the object. And let me show you, I've got one here, I've got a bug, got a beetle here that I've cut out. And now it doesn't take up, it's not quite as big, but it doesn't take up as much space, so it shows more of the background, and people will like that. However, this white shape around the legs, because I've cut it out, that's the halo. So it has this kind of white area around it. That's really distracting, and it doesn't tie into the shape of my pages. So that might not be something that I want to do here, because that's just kind of odd, and I might have to work to really kind of cover those things up. And so the last option when you cut something out is to cut out right along the edge. So with this insect, with this beetle, it'd be very, very hard to kind of cut out around all the different legs and such. So, you know, that's going to be really hard. But with something like my brain, I can do that. And so even now, even though it's still, this is even bigger than the first one, it's covering up a lot. If I were to glue that in now, it feels more like part of the page. It's not just this big rectangle slapped on. And so I like to do that with like shapes like this, or people, like cut out around a person and really kind of have that silhouette in. Okay, so kind of cutting that out and gluing that down. Now, like I said, probably wouldn't do that here where there's a whole lot going on, but if I go back to pages that I've been working in, you know, something like this might be a perfect spot. Again, this spread is kind of in the beginning stages, so if I were to glue this in now, it would really be easy to layer on top of that. Okay, so even something like this, you know, I can glue it in, and it's still early enough in the process that this doesn't stand out as much. You know, even like over here, it doesn't really stand out much because there's a lot of white still. And even this doesn't look too bad on this kind of page because, again, there's not a whole lot going on. If I go back to a blank page, I mean, yeah, I can glue any of these in, and then I can layer on top of them. And it really doesn't matter what's in the back. So when you glue something down at the beginning, in the first stages of your journal or your artwork, it's easier to layer on top of, it's easier to tie it in. But I want to talk about, like, well, what if you do want to go back, and what if you want to glue things into pages that you've already started, and you know, something that has a lot going on. So that's what I'm going to do. I have a couple areas here. Okay, so here I've worked on this page quite a bit, everything from doing my outlining of my shapes to the tracing of the brain to the word awaken. So I've gone ahead already and glued in these 4 stripes, and this is just a printout of one of my web works of art, and I just cut it into some strips and spread them apart. So actually these strips, if you pushed them all together, would connect, but you know, I didn't want to glue in one big piece of collage because it really covered up the back. And you know, I covered up too much, but at least with stripes it doesn't cover up as much. But now it ties in because there's red, and there's red on the rest of this, and it ties into the pink and the reds. So that ties in, but yet it's still really weird. It just kind of like there's these 4 stripes of red and white over here. And so what I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to pull in or like tie it into the background. So besides deciding, like thinking of how I want to cut it, so I did that. I thought about, okay, I'm going to cut it into strips, and then I glued it in. That allowed more of the background to show up. But now I want to think about, like, okay, how can I further tie this in? And one way is to extend, and this is a perfect one to extend what's happening in the collage onto the back of the page. So if I take my red pen and I can start thinking about, okay, connecting. And so, you know, maybe this comes up and connects to that. Now I've used some colored pencil on this on Monday, so it kind of doesn't show up too well there. But then I can do the same thing here. Maybe that comes down and connects there. And then the same thing up here. So just trying to create these connections between the pieces, but then also extending it into other parts. So if I just take some time, now maybe this comes down, maybe there's another one that, and then it extends out. Maybe it comes down and ties into my brain. Okay, and so just extending. Now I don't have to extend every single line, but if I extend some of them, that'll start to tie things in. And so it helps to connect the different pieces, but then it really starts to tie it into the background. So I can continue that. You don't need to see me do that. Let me show you one that I've done already that has a lot. So on this page here, I have something very similar. This is one of the black and white ones that I cut up into strips, with a little web imagery, and it blends in so much now because I extended. So I did a lot of black lines that extend out and really start to fill in that side. And then I've got the other technique I'm going to show is I layered on top of it, and that helps kind of push it in. Again, this was done earlier on the page, so it was a little bit easier to layer on top. So I could just continue and do that and tie it in to other parts of the page. Like this big one could come up. Maybe it goes behind the word. And so again, I can just keep extending, and I can spend a lot of time doing that. So that's one thing to kind of think about, just extending it. And then thinking about working on top of other pieces. So let me go ahead. I want to go back. I want to go back here because I have something where I started, and I have, I've got this picture of me here. And so right now it's just this big empty space. And so, like I said, when you're working from the beginning, it's easy to collage or to integrate that collage into the work, because you can just paint over top of it, you can draw over top of it. And this is a photocopy, so I can paint over it, it's not going to run or bleed. If you print something out from your home computer, that inkjet printer, it will bleed, so be careful of that. However, this is a little bit shiny, so in the darker areas, like paint and stuff's not going to really stick because it's kind of shiny. But I do want to do something to kind of start tying this in. So I'm going to turn to some other trusty old materials that I use a lot. So I got my Inktense pencils, and I've got some Punchinella. And I'm just going to put this right over top. And so just like I've done before, I can do some things. But what I want to do, I don't want to avoid the piece of collage. And that's what some people do. They're like, oh, well, I can't work on top of it. I got to keep it so it can be seen easily. And then if I do that, then that's when I get that sort of, it floats on top of everything. Maybe I don't want to cover up, a lot of the collage, but if I do some of these little circles here and there, maybe stay away from the eyes. Okay. And so just that right now, all of a sudden, just kind of ties the picture into the background. And if I take my paintbrush and start to spread it, now some of that blue spreads into the picture, And so wherever there's white in the picture, it kind of picks up some of that blue. And so now it's not just a rectangle inside of this big white blank page. It has this layer of the Inktense pencils over top of it. Okay, so I could let that dry, and I could add watercolor, I could do ink, there's all kind of other stuff that I can do. But like I said, it's so easy to do that at the very beginning. It's so easy to work on it. It's a beginning layer, I can layer on top of it. So what happens? What about if I come back here to other areas? So I've gone ahead on here and I've glued in 2 circles of text from that old book. So right now they look really weird. It's just they really stand out. There's nothing else like it. So I could repeat it, and I did circles on purpose. I have circles here, but also if they were squares, maybe they would tie in more. So how do I then push this into the page? Well, one of the easiest ways is to take my pen, since it goes over these red lines. So if I take my pen and just go back and draw those in. So this is kind of the opposite of extending. So I'm not extending what's happening on the collage out into the background. I am basically taking what's happening in the background and bringing it in. And all of a sudden you can see how, like, oh yeah, that just pushes that piece in. This is still floating on top. But if I do the same thing, so this is just that notion of layering on top of the collage. And I could do that lots of different ways. So I could do it with the with Inktense pencil. I could do it with more collage. I could do it with all kind of other stuff. So just those 3 little lines added help push that down. Now if I really wanted to kind of fade into the background, then I can turn to some watercolor. So I've got some of my Inktense paint over here, and if I take some of this is a blue paint, and if I just take some of that and paint over top, so I'm not trying to like completely hide it, but the blue starts to push it down in. Now it's gotten a little bit darker just from the paint, from the water. Once it dries, I'll still be able to see the circles, but they'll tie more into the background. I could do something where I did the punchinella over top of it and did things. So I could just layer on top of it, and that's what happened over here too. So I have the Inktense pencil, I've got some of the red ink, some blue ink, and that all kind of builds on top of the collage. So when you really start to look through a lot of what I've done, so with this map, like there's a stripe of the map here. So I've done just some ink on top of it. All right, some ink up here. But over here, I took some Inktense pencil and went over top, so it kind of blends in there. So when you flip through, like this one has a lot, is just kind of buried in underneath. So yeah, I do that a lot. I really try to push the collage. I think this one has a great example that I started out with a big piece of map over here, and then the strips of map, and then the strips of writing. And because I just worked on top, I drew, I used the paint, I used the Inktense pencils, I even used colored pencils. It really, the map just kind of melts into the background. And then over here, I was doing the web, and then that kind of ties in and goes over top of the map and over top of the writing. It just really helps push it into the page and just makes it feel like it's all connected. Now I do feel like this is missing something. I feel like it needs a central, like, focal image. So I'm thinking like maybe there needs to be some kind of maybe tape transfer or piece of collage, and maybe I do want that thing to stand out. So it's not like you always have to push the collage in, but if you ever look at your pages, you ever look at your work, and you just kind of feel like, I glued that thing in, and it doesn't feel like it's part of the page, then that's a perfect time to think about how you're going to kind of integrate the work. So today's just kind of a quick little lesson. Just wanted to kind of, I know at this point, if you've been doing a lot of collage, you might have that feeling like, it's like what I'm doing isn't quite like just fitting into the page. And so I just wanted to kind of give people a couple ways to think about how they're integrating collage. So just to kind of review, first you can think about how you're cutting it. So are you just cutting out a simple shape? Are you doing the halo? Are you cutting out the silhouette of the image, of the object, and gluing it down? The other thing is that you can extend. So if you have, like, say you have a map that you glued in, or a piece of map, you could extend the roads of the map out into the background of the page. And then finally, layering on top. And you have to pay attention to the material. So if you're using a very shiny magazine picture, it's going to be harder to kind of incorporate because you can't paint over top of it with watercolor. It's going to kind of, the paint's going to bead up. It just doesn't quite work. But you might be able to use a pen on top or a paint marker. So just being able to layer on top of the collage, and it's always easier to do that at the beginning of the pages. So if you're getting to the point where you're like, oh, I have these things at the end, I'm gluing them on, and they feel like they're floating, and I don't like that, how do I incorporate that? That's what this was all about. So hopefully you got a few good tips about how you might go and tackle that problem and work with the collage. So, as always, think about if you have any questions or comments. See if you can always leave them in the comments. I'm just trying to see if anybody left anything. So Tracy was asking about like using multiple images many times. So I like to do that because I like using images over and over again for a couple of different reasons, because they become kind of symbolic to me. That notion, I'm a very introverted, thoughtful guy, I think, and so the brain kind of represents that to me, and also it's a universal image. People know that, and then also it's easy to print them out. I can go and make copies of them or print them out. I have a laser printer at my office, so I can print stuff out there. And then when I was a teacher, it was easy. I can make copies on the school copier, but they're very symbolic, and then also it's a stylistic thing. So artists often go back and use the same images over and over again because there's something about them. They keep exploring them. What does it look like in this context? What does it look like in that context? And so it's just something that it's just something that I use over and over again, because then that way when you go through and you flip through, you're like, oh, okay, there's continuity there. There's this idea that this person, it becomes part of their style, just like there are certain colors that you might like. So that's a little bit about why I use the same thing. I don't know about no, shoot, just lost my my train of thought. But yeah, it's just kind of the way I work. I don't feel like I have to like always find new things to use, because when you use some of the same things, you're just using them in a different context. And I don't use a lot of magazine pictures either, just because I don't feel that much of a connection, and I'm not one that goes to and buys antique photographs. I know you can go to like thrift stores and antique shops, and sometimes you find like boxes and bins of other people's photographs, and to me, I just don't have a connection to that. I'd much rather, like, I recently actually in this one I recently printed out pictures, so I've got a whole bunch of my own photos that I've printed out and I've used. So here's one of my wife's one of the flowers, and then I've cut some things out. So yeah, so I'd much rather use my own images, or I like that brain image because it's a kind of a generic image. And then somebody was asking about the journals, about how I feel about using used books, like altered books or handmade books. I think everyone kind of finds their own way and finds what's comfortable for them. I know there are a lot of artists that love altered books, and they'll they find awesome books to use, and I know teachers a lot of times use altered books with students. I personally don't do that. I like having that blank page to kind of begin with, because when you alter books, you have to end up using a lot of people do gesso, and then it's a lot of acrylic stuff, so it's not as convenient. I like having a book that I can just throw in my bag, take anywhere. I can use watercolor pencil in it, and not have to worry too much about needing water or acrylic paint or things that are only kind of good in the studio. And then as far as handmade books, I've used some that other people have made. I don't have a desire to really make my own, other than I've done a class where I've made little tiny pamphlet stitch books that have we use 6 sheets of paper, and then you fold it, and then of course you get 24 little pages. So I've done that, but it's that's something that takes 10 minutes to do. But as far as my everyday journal, I mean, I use an 11 by 14 inch sketchbook, and if I were to try to make something that big, it would probably cost 2 to 3 times more than it does to buy the sketchbook, and take a long time to actually put it together. And I'm not interested in that. And it's also really interesting to me is that I can use the same sketchbook year after year after year, and what happens in them is totally different. So, the original size and shape and everything is exactly the same, but then they all end up looking totally different. So that's just me, though. And I think everybody kind of figures out what works for them. So just flipping through some more of the comments. So anyway, hopefully that helped answer some of those questions. And but anyway, if you've got any more, pop them into the comments. Love to hear from you, and really appreciate you spending your morning with me. And just a quick reminder, if anybody's watching before, if you're all watching live, then you'll this is before, but if you're catching the video replay, I'm doing a virtual meetup today at 1 p.m. You need an invitation. It's not the same as the one from last week, so you need a new one. So if you're planning on popping into that, you gotta contact me for the invitation, and we're gonna do that at 1 p.m. Eastern today. So anyway, appreciate you joining me once again, and I'm going to keep doing this. I'll be back on Monday morning and Wednesday mornings, at least definitely next week, and probably for a few more weeks. So hopefully I can come up with more stuff to talk about and cover. So if you got any questions, please make sure you ask and pop them in the comments. Really appreciate you being here. So thanks so much. Have an awesome day, and maybe I'll see you at 1 p.m. in our virtual meetup.